Good evening, everyone. I hope you got well into the new year. I just have a favor to ask you. Would some of you at least please put your camera on, because it's so much nicer when I'm actually talking to people instead of just a screen with names. Hi. It makes it a little more relatable, you see. There you are. Thank you. So coming into the new year, did you come into the new year with the New Year resolutions and ideas about what you're going to do this year? We tend to do it. Now I know things were a little bit different this year, but nevertheless, with a question, I'm just kind of, if you would like to share, maybe if you thought of something, if you took a New Year resolution, if it's something at least you thought about doing, or if it kind of wasn't in the picture this year.
I'm happy to share. So for me, it was sort of not so much a resolution, more of a kind of intention, which is let go and have no fear. So these are kind of, to start with anyway, sort of my themes for this year.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one, especially now, because it's not so easy. Anyone else who want to share? Okay, I will not insist, but we had one idea at least, to let go of fears. Now, somehow it's not by chance, of course, that such a topic is coming at the time it does of the year. My name is Maria, by the way. I don't think I introduced myself, so if I don't know some of you, my name is Maria. I'm a Tantra teacher and yoga teacher, meditation teacher, running Shakti groups and retreats and so on here at Tara Yoga Center. So we chose this topic, or I chose this topic, to speak about making efforts. Now in the beginning of the year, of course, not entirely by chance, also not by chance my question about your New Year resolutions, because somehow here in the beginning of the year, we tend to have an idea of making some efforts to obtain something or to achieve something. So it is a good moment to speak about making efforts, what that means and why we're doing it and how we can do it correctly. Also why it's important. Especially considering that very often our New Year resolutions are famous for not really lasting too long, and therefore never reaching somehow the goal that we set out to obtain in that process. Now, for instance, when you want to obtain a very kind of clear result, like, I don't know, you take a New Year resolution of eating more healthily or something, the efforts in which you need to put in to achieve that are probably a bit more obvious, perhaps, than in the case of, for instance, wanting to let go of fear, or in other ways, freeing yourself maybe of some negative habits, emotionally or mentally. Nevertheless, we are talking about making efforts, regardless of what it is that we are wanting to achieve. Now, this ideas around efforts, some of it, at least, and largely, is taken from actually from a lecture that I listened to beginning of the year. I think it was 2018, just around New Year, from yoga teacher Grigor Ndivolaru, who had some ideas around effort and what it implies to make beneficial efforts. And I found it quite inspiring, especially because somehow when we say efforts, I think many of us consider it something a little bit negative or difficult, perhaps because it is in a sense. But also I think we have a lot of misunderstanding around what it means to make efforts, and even why we're doing it. Because in reality, this lecture actually I listened to was part of a series around happiness. All of them intended to bring us more happiness, more fulfillment in our lives. And it kind of occurred to me in that moment that the idea of putting happiness or the pursuit of happiness in together with effort somehow in a way seems counterintuitive, I think, as a first reaction a little bit, because effort seems to be something a bit unpleasant, whereas happiness is the exact opposite as we envision it many times. So it is from the perspective of happiness, actually, that we will be speaking about efforts, why efforts are necessary in order for us to be happy and to reach the happiness that we are all of us searching for, even if we might do it in different ways, with different ideas of also what that happiness means or entails on a practical level. Nevertheless, effort will always be required in order for us to obtain, especially what we can call a lasting happiness. But I will return to that in a moment. First, to consider what an effort is, as I'm speaking about it now. If we are to go more on the dictionary definition of an effort, we can say it's a voluntary unfolding of an effort that is either made physically, so with the physical body, we could make an effort to move something heavy or move ourselves across a long distance or something, but a physical effort. It could also be an effort that implies, we can say, somehow a psychic or emotional effort, where we are making efforts to sustain something emotionally. Or it could be an effort more of kind of mental or intellectual, in a more mental or intellectual manner, where we can say we kind of have in a way a tension of consciousness seeking to understand something or stretching to understand and encompass something and therefore gain a bigger understanding. But regardless which type of effort or force we can say we're mobilizing, whether it is a physical one, more emotional, psychic, or more mental effort that we are mobilizing in that moment, it means somehow mobilizing a force in order to overcome an obstacle. That force that we are mobilizing could either be the force that we have available for us in this very moment where we're making that effort, or we are mobilizing ourselves. Or it could also be, as we will see, a little bit a different approach, where we make the efforts to attract the force needed, so to speak, by engaging in processes of occult resonances, those of you who are in our courses will know about already. So entering in process of resonance with the willpower we need, or with a state of happiness or a higher state of fulfillment and so on, making the effort to do that in order to mobilize ourselves to get rid of the opposite state, for instance. But I'll return a little bit to that as well. So the idea basically is that we mobilize our force, regardless of what type of efforts we are talking about, in order to overcome a resistance or an obstacle that could either be inside of us or outside of us. Sometimes the obstacle, in case you want to, I don't know, come across a distance, or I don't know, pull yourself out of the water or something like this, that could be an obstacle in that moment where it takes physical efforts. You're overcoming what we could say is an obstacle on the outside. Or it could also be the obstacle of some difficult circumstances in your life or other things in your outer environment that you need to mobilize yourself to overcome. Sometimes the resistance that we're aiming to overcome is more of an internal one. It could be exactly like the fear element, for instance, where that's an inner experience that we aim to mobilize ourselves to overcome that inner reaction. Or it could be a state of depression. It could be other obstacles, let's say, we feel we have inside of ourselves. So we could say that an effort, somehow summed up, is a conscious being mobilizing all their forces, respective to what they're wishing to overcome, in order to overcome an obstacle or a resistance. Therefore, making efforts somehow is difficult, because we are connecting it with the idea of overcoming an obstacle, which per definition is something that we will find difficult to do. So there is that association. Whereas on the other hand, when we say that something is done without effort, it is somehow saying that that thing is done without us having to try much, with great ease, kind of just going with the flow, and everything went without us having to somehow mobilize ourselves in that direction in order to have to defeat any kind of resistance, maybe because the resistance wasn't there so much, whether it was inside or outside. And obviously that sounds much more attractive. We tend to be much more attracted to such an idea of not having to make effort, or just finding that we are flowing through life without any resistance. Of course, that's not so often the situation, unless, of course, we consider to just, we can say, adjust the aspirations or the ambitions we have for our life to our current circumstances or to whatever happens. In that case, we would experience that there is no resistance because we're also not aspiring for anything in particular. In a sense, it can seem like the more we aspire towards, the more resistance there is, because the more defined somehow our direction is, and therefore also will imply making efforts in the direction of what we are aspiring to. Therefore, on a spiritual path that is defined by aspiration, we can say, an aspiration for knowing ourselves and our aspiration for growth, for transformation, there will be obstacles, there will be resistance to overcome in that process, and therefore also efforts will be necessary. Now, this situation with the effort clearly implying a difficulty, of course, tend to make us consider that it's not really part of feeling happy, or somehow even potentially contradictory to happiness, which very often actually you hear people defining a little bit as a situation where you don't have to make an effort. That's kind of when you feel happy, when no effort is required. That's kind of when you can feel happy and be relaxed. We have even very much this mindset, you know, oh, when it's weekend, I will feel happy, I will feel good. I finished my efforts for the week of working. So once I get to Friday afternoon, evening, I can relax and I can be happy somehow. So we have little breaks of happiness perceived in between the efforts that we are making throughout the week. Now, this is one of the solutions, we can say, to being happy, is to make these a certain kind of effort, we can say, and to consider that our happiness is gained in the breaks in between. Now, we all wish to be happy. It's even the foundation, we can say, of the efforts we're making on a spiritual path or anything else we're doing in life. If there is something that is common for all human beings, is that we're striving for happiness. We wish to be happy, which of course can look differently to different people. We'll have different ideas of what happiness entails or what a happy life looks like. But nevertheless, we all have in common that that is something we wish for and that we long for. And then we have different strategies applied in order to obtain happiness or being happy. One of them would be somehow by organizing our lives to experience moments of pleasure. So that pleasure could be having the weekend off and doing nothing, or it could be moments of intense physical pleasure in various ways, lovemaking, for instance. It could be pleasure by eating something you really like, or in other ways, feeling pleasure. There is a profound connection between pleasure and happiness. You could even say that pleasure is an important ingredient of happiness for a human being, to experience pleasure in different ways. And then we could organize ourselves in a way that we try to create these moments of happiness. Now, the problem is that when we approach it like that, these moments of pleasure in our week, for instance, a bit like the weekend becomes the moment of pleasure. The problem is that the time in between kind of becomes a bit of dead time, often even felt a bit as something you have to get over with, a bit of a sort of meaningless existence between the highlights of your life, with the result that a lot of your life kind of just becomes in between moments, between those moments where you feel happy or you experience pleasure. So it's not a very satisfactory solution to happiness, because it is just glimpses from time to time, whereas the biggest part of your existence becomes somewhat unsatisfactory, dull, maybe even painful, and a little bit considered the part of suffering that has to be over and done with in between those moments. A different strategy we could consider, which would be one that would give us more happiness, overall speaking, would be to organize our lives in such a way that our happiness becomes, we can say, established to the extent that it becomes a part of our life experience, that it lasts, we can say in other words, and does not leave us. So it's not these fleeting moments of pleasure or happiness that comes with that pleasure, but more of a lasting experience of happiness. A happiness that will even be able to be there when life is difficult, because of course it still will be at times. Being happy doesn't necessarily mean removing all difficulty, even if we often have that as an idea in our head, together with the idea that effort is not something pleasant. We also consider that happiness means the obstacle of any difficulty or challenge. Life will never be like that. So obviously, as long as we wish for the happily ever after, meaning nothing more happened after that, we feel cheated, because it doesn't work like this. However, when we approach happiness a bit differently than these flashes of pleasure and therefore happiness in life, we will see that happiness can become lasting in a way that it's enduring, also through difficult moments, through hard times, and so on. There is what we can call a background of happiness. Now, this intuition is in fact what lead many people also to a spiritual practice, whether they're approaching it through meditation, yoga, being interested in erotic tantric practices, or whatever it is. There is something there. We have a feeling there is a different quality to happiness, that it's possible to be happy pretty much all the time, so to speak, and not just having glimpses or tastes of happiness that leave us a little bit almost melancholic because it passes away so quickly, and who knows when it comes back somehow. So the kind of happiness we're talking about when we talk about making efforts is this durable kind of happiness that we are working towards. But it does imply the efforts. Therefore, when we're very deeply rooted in this idea that efforts is not kind of correlated with happiness, or maybe even contradictory to it, unfortunately, often also profound happiness passes us by. We're not able to touch it because we don't understand these mechanisms. Somehow we can say that beneficial efforts that we're making is a little bit like gathering drops or something. It's not so that when you make efforts, immediately you will feel super happy, which is also the challenge. Making efforts is something you start, just like a New Year resolution. And then maybe you don't see results immediately, not huge ones anyway. That's also why many New Year resolutions don't really last, because your world is not completely different from one day to another. You kind of have to gather, like drops, somehow the effects of those efforts, until suddenly you have a full glass. Also in what we would call in spiritual practice, a spiritual leap. Very often, for instance, when we practice, we can start practicing yoga or meditation. Maybe it's the most obvious with meditation. Meditation practice in the beginning is a lot of efforts that you put in. And it can even seem like you're not really getting anywhere, because you sit there and you struggle and you struggle, and you are not in deep ecstatic states of meditation every single day when you practice. But then suddenly it's as if you accumulate enough training, and then something shifts inside, not only when you meditate, but also in the rest of your life. Your perspective is profoundly different. You are affected in a different way by things that happens around you. You see it in a different way. You respond to things in a different way. You experience things completely different. But if we were to judge on the progress somehow day by day, especially in the beginning, we would say, oh, come on, this isn't working, and simply drop these efforts. So in this way, the beneficial efforts that we're making takes a certain patience and also a certain dedication to what we are aiming to achieve in that moment. It has to do with a particular mind setup, which I'll return to very shortly again. On the other hand, we also actually have what we can call bad efforts, or efforts that doesn't serve us. And we do that a lot, probably even more than the beneficial efforts for most people, because we have an idea that making efforts is something we do very consciously. Beneficial efforts indeed is something we do consciously. It's something we do on purpose, so to speak. But there's also such a thing as making a lot of efforts without necessarily doing it consciously or on purpose, so to speak. What I mean is that, for instance, for a bad habit, sometimes we can make a lot of efforts to sustain it. For instance, I don't know, you really, really want chocolate, not that there's anything wrong with that, and then you're willing to make a lot of efforts, even if it's 2 a.m, to find somewhere that they're open to get your chocolate. That would be a big effort. Actually, the best example I can think of with this was a story I read about a woman who actually solved her problem with coloring books. That was what was fascinating me, but that was kind of like a meditative practice for her. But anyway, this woman was obese and she was completely addicted to McDonald's food, but like completely. So much so that even if she was otherwise quite lazy and heavy because she ate a lot and was really unhealthy, she would get up or get out of the house at 2 a.m, because those cravings were so overwhelming, take the car and drive half an hour to get a meal. All times of year, even when it was freezing, just because the McDonald's close to her wasn't open at night. So she had to go for a drive to get to McDonald's. And she said she got to that point where she was, driving around in the middle of the night to get her fix somehow, because she was so addicted to that food. And that's when she found the coloring books that distracted her and made her calm down and even work through that issue and so on. So it was a happy ending. But nevertheless, this idea that we're able to make incredible efforts without even really considering it an effort, because we're super addicted to something usually. So it usually comes with a sort of an addiction, these unconscious efforts that we're making, which sometimes is even contradictory to our health and happiness in reality. It could also be an addiction, not necessarily only to food or to something that you can eat. It could also be, I don't know, an alcohol addiction, or even an addiction to certain emotions or to a person, where that attachment somehow becomes so strong that we're willing to make incredible efforts to keep it, even if it's hurting us. And we're not even realizing somehow that's an effort too, because you can say it will take efforts to change that habit or to break that attachment. Maybe it can even seem like overwhelming efforts that would take, but we don't realize how much effort we're putting into holding on to that bad habit, whatever it is, or that negative behavior, which is actually hurting us or working against what we are wishing to achieve, and can even somehow drag us down bit by bit. Again, it doesn't come all at once. One time you manifest something, but it doesn't come all at once, the consequences of that. It is something that is building in time. Therefore, this ability to become aware somehow of the efforts we make, let's say, is an important first step to see whether we are making beneficial efforts or efforts that might actually be opposite to what we are aiming to achieve. So somehow we're always going to make efforts, even when we feel we're just doing what we want. We can make very big efforts sometimes for that, but there's still efforts. We're still spending a lot of energy and power in that. So in a way, you can say, to begin with, we can make even the efforts to shift to a positive way of making efforts, because that's a habit too, in a sense. Assigning all that energy and all that effort in a direction we can see will be overall beneficial and positive for us, rather than in a direction that will actually hurt us or make life more difficult for us in the long run. So it can be good when you see yourself making efforts, and that's of course the first contemplation, noticing that now you're actually mobilizing yourself towards something, just to ask yourself how this effort is helping you. Like, what is it actually helping you to achieve in that moment? And just bringing clarity on the end goal and that effort you're making could make you see things in a completely different light. Because of course, even when we have an addiction or we are attached to something or somebody, it's because we believe it's going to make us happy. I mean, that's why we're doing it. It's just that sometimes we forget and stop and see, is this making me happy, this direction? Because it's more this quick fix. In the case of the McDonald's food, for instance, she feels good in the moment she eats it. So that's a moment of happiness, apparently. But overall speaking, it was making her life worse and worse, those efforts she made in that direction. So it's important for us to ask ourselves, this effort, why am I actually doing it? Is it for my happiness, or what am I trying to achieve with the effort that I'm doing in this moment? And of course, if we realize that it's an effort that is somehow coming from an obsessive behavior, an attachment, or bad habit, we should do our utmost to make efforts in the opposite direction, namely the efforts of not acting on that impulse or not making those efforts, but changing the direction of our energy and our force. Because always, whether it's a conscious effort or not, it implies we mobilize ourselves to do something. We might as well mobilize ourselves in a direction that will, overall speaking, make us more happy. Now, this idea is not by any means a new one. The importance actually of being able to have such a perspective in order to be healthy and happy. There was an experiment that became very famous also because Daniel Goleman, the guy who wrote about emotional intelligence, spoke about it quite a bit. So you probably heard about it in some sort of context or some variations made around that experiment. In the original one, it was about the 3-4-year-olds and marshmallows. So the kids were put somehow with the condition that if they eat the marshmallow right now, they have one marshmallow placed in front of them, they can eat it now and have it, or they can wait a bit and then they will get 2. So they will get more if they wait. And then it was somehow an experiment to see how the kids would respond and if, like, how impulsive they were. And of course, some kids were more impulsive than others, not able to wait and resist that temptation. They would eat it straight away. Other children, for some reason, were able to restrain themselves and have somehow what we would otherwise call delayed gratification and hold out in order to get more in the end. Now, the initial conclusions of the experiment was, because they checked in with them, I think 12, 14 years later, was that the children who manifested somehow the self-control or could resist their initial impulse also tend to do better in life, generally speaking. So it was noticed that they were more effective, self-confident, capable to easily and promptly surpass deceptions, disillusions, and the trials of life. So somehow they were more balanced, manifested less fear and self-doubt, and somehow were just generally speaking more confident and balanced in their experience of life. Now, what made that experiment a little bit limited was the idea that you are either like that or not, which is not actually true, because it's not about just this impulse control. It's more related to the ability to have cognitive control, we can say. So the ability to kind of have an awareness of yourself is also related to how quickly you can somehow calm down after having a negative emotion. Your ability to concentrate, to focus, and so on is related to that impulse control, but it's something that can be learned. So it's not that either you have it as a 4-year-old and then you'll have a nice life, or you don't have it and then your life will be much harder. It is an ability that we can train this. And actually meditation is one of the very good ways to do so, meditation and yoga, to increase this, what we can call cognitive control, which also comes with increased emotional intelligence, which of course is why Daniel Goleman brought up this experiment in that context. But nevertheless, the ability to just have self-awareness in that moment, because that was somehow the biggest difference. Some of the kids were able to somehow compute the idea, if I wait half an hour, however much it is, I will get 2 instead of 1, and somehow have the self-discipline in that moment to not act on it. Others couldn't at that age do the same thing. Essentially, that's what we do, we can say, when we are making beneficial efforts. Not that necessarily marshmallows is the highest goal that we can set ourselves, but nevertheless, this development of what we can call cognitive control, which then affects a lot of different areas of our life. For instance, this aspect of calming down after you have had a negative emotion or a difficult emotion. You get very angry or very agitated or very sad or about something that happens. If you have the ability to wait, so to speak, was the correlation they made as well, or the ability in that moment to make some efforts, you're also able to much faster calm yourself, making efforts to calm and center yourself, and then react differently to that situation instead of just flying off the handle, for instance. So these are even side effects, we can say, that comes from making beneficial efforts. But it's also true that people who are naturally so inclined, it's easier for them to make beneficial efforts. And that's also what this experiment showed, that for some, this seems to come easier. And that's the people you see who just kind of seems to be able to make the correct effort and attain just about anything they set out to do. There are not so many, it's true, but you see a lot of examples. And then it seems others, they just can't do it and feel a bit lost somehow in that direction. And the more times we fail to live up to what we promised ourselves, the more disencouraged somehow we are, and we kind of just end up giving up a little bit. Like, for instance, around New Year resolutions, the more years you put yourself a resolution that you didn't deliver on, the harder it is to believe yourself every year that now you're going to do it this time. But it is important to understand that it's not just how we are. We have the possibility to transform that. But of course, first for that, we need to realize the problem and then take steps bit by bit in that direction. To transform our habit, because that is a habit too, and in that direction is not, as I said, so that you are either born with it or not. You can change that. It's a matter of education in reality for many. Also how they're taught as children, how the school system have been and so on, how we then relate to the notion of effort later on in our lives. Now, somehow, generally speaking, we can say in society, and we have a hope, maybe all of us have this secret hope, that we don't have to make efforts, that we can just swallow a pill and everything will be perfect, or we can just, meet the right person and we will live happily ever after, or, that someday something will just twist and everything will be easy and perfect and we will live in perfect happiness without having to make efforts for it. So we kind of have a hope that things will just come easy or for free somehow our way if we are lucky. But for real transformation, we can say, and real growth, efforts will always be completely necessary. Otherwise, we're a little bit at the whim of circumstances when we're just hoping for a quick fix or an easy way out. And again, also, so it is with happiness. This happiness, in a way, we can say, is built bit by bit, because a profound state of happiness is a result of an overall state of harmony. There is a very close connection between the state of harmony and the state of happiness. So somehow when we achieve a certain balance or harmony in life, happiness will emerge as a result of that. And that is something that is built bit by bit with our adequate beneficial efforts, we can say, in different directions. There will, of course, be different moments to make different types of efforts. I think very often when we think of efforts, we have this idea of, I don't know, athletes training for the triathlon or something. All these, I don't know, I have Nike commercials coming to mind or something. Very often when thinking of what it means to make efforts. And of course, it doesn't always look like that. Efforts will also be adequate to the goal that we are wishing to achieve. And not all of us have a dream, after all, of being professional athletes. But we will have in different moments of our lives different priorities, and therefore there will be, we can say, adequate efforts to make in that direction for different moments and different purposes in our existence, and therefore also different types of efforts, what it means to make efforts. I want to look a little bit at different ways of making efforts, actually, because I think also sometimes we, as I said, have a little bit of a narrow idea of what it means to make efforts. for instance, this like physical effort is usually what comes to mind. But there are many ways in which we can make efforts, also again corresponding to these different levels of our being and therefore different types of effort. Now, for instance, taking such a thing as having a daily yoga or meditation practice, that would imply a particular kind of effort to overcome sometimes your comfort and maybe laziness to either stay in bed or go to bed early or watch a movie or do something else instead of what you promised yourself to do if you decided, for instance, to do yoga daily for a while or to meditate, seeing the benefits and actually wanting it. But then in the name of that, after a while, your enthusiasm fades a little and you will have to make some efforts. And that sometimes means sacrificing, for instance, also other things, such as watching a movie or doing nothing, or you have to get up a bit earlier, or in other ways, make efforts to make space for that. Could also be efforts made in the direction of having a particular diet, realizing that you don't feel well because you are not eating in a way that is good for you and therefore wishing to make changes in that direction. Could even be a change or kind of an effort, we can say, to refrain. For instance, if you introduce such a thing as fasting, that is, you realize is very rejuvenating and beneficial for your system, then it would imply a particular effort to refrain from eating, whether you do it intermittently or a full day or how you approach it. Everyone who tried fasting knows that there's a particular kind of effort involved there in refraining in that moment from giving into temptation and eating something until you get more in the habit of your body functioning like that. Also, it takes effort to look at difficult emotions. Another thing that will be necessary when being in a process of transformation or growth. There will be some things coming up for us. This can be difficult emotions, difficult inner states. It also takes a certain, we can say, effort to put yourself to look at that instead of just distracting yourself with chatting or some internet or running away from situations that will trigger it, or in other ways, just not really making the effort of going there. That does imply an effort on our part to look into those things. Also, we can say it implies a certain effort to be open for feedback or to learn from our mistakes and take responsibility for our actions, because it seems much easier to just avoid responsibility, to reject the feedback so we don't have to look at it, to cover up our mistakes so that we don't have to be faced with the consequences of our actions and so on. But also we will not learn, we will not grow, we will not transform in any way. And then ultimately speaking, we will be way more unhappy. One of the favorite quotes from Einstein, at least it was described to at a certain point, that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. However, when we don't want to make efforts, that's kind of what we're stuck into. We keep doing things the way we have been doing it, often by avoiding certain parts of life or certain parts of ourselves, because we don't really want to mobilize in that direction. But then also life stays the way it is, however much a little happy that is somehow in that moment. So it's on the other side of happiness that we, or of efforts, that we can find the happiness or a different type of life experiences, at least, that might make us more happy. Now, continuing also a little bit in this idea of making efforts, because efforts are needed for all kinds of accomplishments in life. And I'm not just talking about, I don't know, career accomplishments or fitness accomplishments or whatever we could make efforts for, but in reality, everything that we accomplish. I want to take a little bit the example of a relationship, just to show how efforts are present there too, in a way that maybe we wouldn't normally consider being efforts, in this sense of making physical efforts or efforts in work-wise or something. We can call having a happy relationship, for instance, is quite a considerable accomplishment somehow, and therefore also implies efforts. like everything else that gives us happiness or lasting happiness. Now, if we look at a relationship, somehow when we first meet, we make a lot of efforts to be together. Usually it's a little bit easier because we're in love, and we're happy to make a lot of efforts to get to see each other, to spend time, to somehow let go of different habits we have in order to be able to facilitate the togetherness in that relationship. But at the same time, it also applies efforts. It might be that we find it easy to make those efforts because we really like what's happening, but nevertheless, there are a lot of efforts there. For instance, kind of typically on the side of a man, you will have the impression that a woman makes his life way more complicated than it has to be. And suddenly he has to pay attention to a lot of things he doesn't find very relevant or maybe unnecessary. And it just seems to complicate things completely unnecessarily, like having to be romantic or do things that he just find superfluous or unimportant. Yet if he will make these efforts, somehow he will also discover that his life might be a little bit less comfortable, so to speak, than it was, but also a lot richer, more nuanced, and a lot of things will appear to him that wasn't visible before, and actually will bring him great fulfillment. Making the effort, we can say, to overcome that tendency towards being comfortable in the beginning. Now, typically for a woman, she has a different experience. Of course, this is typically, it's not always exactly this way around. But for a woman, when she opens herself emotionally and especially erotically also to somebody else, she tends to be brought face to face with a lot of emotions of different kinds. That can be very intense even at times, and some of them confronting maybe and not so comfortable. Could be insecurities, fear of rejection, other things that come up in that moment. And she will somehow have to make the efforts to be with that and to deal with that, and also to transform what makes her feel like that in those moments, to make the efforts to go through, we can say, those experiences. And in the process, becoming more harmonious and therefore also happier, healthier, generally speaking, in life, not just in the context of that relationship. So somehow we can say in the situation that I just described, the woman becomes a call for the man to leave his comfort zone and to jump a little bit more into the stream of life, which is an effort to do that, even if it's very satisfying when you manage. And then for the woman, the man can become somehow a mirror of her inner life, her inner world, that will also allow her to become more conscious and more aware of herself and the many wonderful things actually that she holds inside, to have this increased self-awareness. But again, it is also something that takes efforts on her part to allow that to happen. And these are gifts that we can only realize if we're willing to make the efforts to have that experience. If we just give up when things are a little bit uncomfortable or a bit confronting on either side, we will never discover that profound happiness of actually getting together and building a relationship, for instance. And just staying a little bit with this example, because it is a good one to show how we are making efforts in many different ways, even if we don't necessarily think of it like that. There is the idea of intimacy, for instance, in the couple, to have real intimacy between the two lovers, starting even with the emotional intimacy. It takes some effort to let go of our fears, our protection mechanisms, to dare to be vulnerable, to open up, to connect to each other. It actually takes a lot of effort, somehow sustained efforts, to dare to do that and to somehow break down that wall or cross that bridge, however we want to put it, but to touch each other really somehow on an emotional level. And the whole also tendency to close down and pull away that we have when we feel in danger of getting hurt and so on, it takes efforts not to do that, somehow to be aware of it and to not go in that direction. Even more when we then speak about erotic intimacy, for instance. To really deepen our intimacy, our erotic experiences to a degree where they become profoundly fulfilling, actually takes a lot of effort. Now, especially if we're speaking about reaching a very profound intimacy in the relationship and practicing what we would call tantric lovemaking, which is a very amazing technique, we can say, for lasting happiness, because it transforms so much your entire perception of yourself and life as a whole. It takes a lot of efforts. And actually, it's a bit like the marshmallow in a way example, because it implies to let go of the familiar satisfaction immediately, to open up to the nuances of satisfaction that comes after that, so to speak. So if we go for the instinctual pleasure that most of us are aware of to begin with, and we rush for that, we will never discover the fullness of the experience that could come if we would just wait a bit for the second marshmallow, so to speak, in that context. Especially when we speak, for instance, about being multi-orgasmic for a man, having to sacrifice the normal way of knowing an orgasm, which implies ejaculation to begin with, could be something really difficult to do. It takes a lot of efforts to move past that. But if he manages to do so, to put in those efforts, suddenly a whole new world will open. The possibility to have much more nuanced experience of lovemaking, multiple orgasms, being fulfilled to a degree that was unknown before. We can say moving from watching the trailer, which can be exciting enough, to actually seeing the movie, being fulfilled, understanding the story, feeling somehow completed in that experience. This we only have a chance to discover if we move past the first layer, and that takes efforts. So somehow this, we can say, deeper layers of fulfillment, the type of happiness where it's not just a momentary pleasure that gives us some happiness and joy in the moment, fleeting, and then we're back to boring everyday life. If we want the kind of fulfillment that makes, I don't know, there's kind of like this sweetness in your soul, there's like a feeling of completeness. That kind of happiness, that kind of pleasure is not fleeting. It's something that stays with you for a long time. And more, the more times you experience, we can say, happiness like that, the depths of the experience like that, the more you establish yourself into a completely different quality of happiness, a completely different quality of life even, I would say. But it does come for sure with the efforts needed, and some of them are not small. It's like there is a whole, kind of how I feel it is, there's a whole world that is somehow protected from those who don't want to make the efforts to go there. You could say the same, by the way, about the land of here and now, the present moment. It's very empty in the present moment because nobody is there. We're all in the past, in the future. We're not right now, because that's something that also implies effort. We like the idea of it, especially if we read maybe The Power of Now or other things that will make us realize how amazing it is to be fully alive now and present here and now. It's a whole different world. It's like living in a different country almost. And especially nowadays, that could be very, very appealing. But the inhabitants are very, very few because it takes efforts. Again, meditation practice, for instance, maybe one of the best ways of getting there. Not easy. You start out, and everyone who had a meditation practice, you know, it can be so difficult some days. Your mind is all over. You feel powerless to bring it back. It's just hard. Your body hurts, whatever it is. It really is a lot of effort that you have to put there. But then suddenly you find yourself in a new world, a completely new world that is very quiet, even if you live in London, because nobody's there, really. So it's somehow a moment where you can just be wherever you want to be, almost. But for sure, in a world that is way more nuanced and way more rich and fulfilling, actually the land where happiness is constant, not just a fleeting moment. But it takes a lot of efforts to get to that place. And that is where most of us don't make it. Especially, for instance, a thing like meditation practice. I saw it a lot. I know the temptation to give up because it's hard and you feel like you're getting nowhere. Somehow it's these little drops in a big glass, somehow a very big cup, and you're just putting little drops and it seems you're not getting anywhere with it until suddenly you do. But that takes really perseverant efforts in order to reach there. Now I can see I already spoke a lot. So maybe I give a bit of time now for some questions or comments if you have it until this point in the talk.
I was just wondering if, you know, if we take an effort, sometimes I experience that I would say I would take too much work, you know, like in one time. I mean, you know, like you can get overwhelmed. And I think my experience is that I would like to achieve everything, maybe not exactly like now, but I can put a lot of effort in one moment, but then, you know, day after day, I experience that the level of the energy, it's lower gradually, despite the fact that I'm doing things I love to do. So then, yeah, I'm just wondering how to find this proper balance, because, you know, sometimes I would say like there are things I love or I'm passionate about, but or there is no kind of how to say certain logic behind that, that I'm doing that for the right reason, then you know, like it's easy to kind of get lost contact with the dream, with this and stuff like that. So I think my question is how to do that right, how to do take effort, you know, with the right measurements, and then if it's right to take a lot of action, how to actually figure out how many things I can do in one time, you know, that it wouldn't get.
Yeah, now just to clarify, when you say that you do things you're passionate about, what kind of things are we talking about?
There are everything from relationship to my work, from the other work I will be doing, working with clients. I think it's like every area of life. I can be more specific if you want, but yeah, I think it relates to everything.
Yeah. So of course you're right. I mean, you can't make efforts in all directions at once because it's not adequate and it will not also necessarily get you to where you want to go. But I mean, also there is a thing we have to remember here, that we say the definition of maturity is not only that we do what we love, but that we love what we do. And it actually has very much about to do with putting heart in what we choose to do. And therefore to have somehow guidance in how to make the right efforts. Now, of course, you might have heart for a lot of things in your life. Hopefully, for most things that are in your life, you will have heart for it somehow. So it is indeed a challenge to find the right proportions between how much effort you're putting in different directions or different areas of your life. It could take some contemplation, but it's good to choose, we can say, projects. That's why actually the whole idea of New Year resolutions is not a bad one at all. If we do it very consciously, it's actually quite a good idea to identify areas that we feel are kind of urgent for us now to look at, or the next step for us to look at, because we can't fix everything at once. Obviously, we will just make a lot of efforts in vain, and we won't necessarily have the force needed to transform everything in one go. So we need to identify at least what are the most important steps right now for my health and my happiness. And sometimes that's presented by the areas that have the most difficulties in the moment. And therefore, of course, you can say you have a certain call of urgency to look into that because it's calling for you. Other times, maybe you don't have things that are so urgent in that sense. And then you can more somehow contemplate what you feel right now to put your efforts, in which direction to put your efforts in this moment. It's it is not also always so easy for us, but at least also where we can start is this idea I had a bit earlier in the beginning actually of the talk. When you're making efforts, just check in with yourself. Is this an effort that I want to make? You know, because also sometimes when we feel, oh, but I just don't have energy for all of this now. I want to put efforts both in my job and in my relationship and in my yoga practice, and I just cannot because I don't have the force I need or I don't have the resources. Often what we ignore is that we're also making a lot of efforts that is spending a lot of resources in the wrong direction. Now I spoke about relationship as an example before. And very often we could put a lot of efforts in negative habits within that relationship, for instance. And the relationship would be a lot better if we would stop putting efforts in that negative habit or negative attitude, for instance, which would also preserve our energy for maybe doing something beautiful in that relationship instead, or having more energy released to look at other areas of your life that also needs efforts or energy from you in that moment. So regardless, it somehow starts with that self-awareness, noticing when you're making efforts and realizing what you're making those efforts for. Like nowadays, you see it a lot, even with like silly things, like for instance, being online. You see people desperate to get Wi-Fi or to get online, and they're willing to do almost anything just to be without the horror of being offline for an hour or however long, because we're super addicted to that element. And then we can really spend a lot of time to solve such an issue. So very often it's just this unconscious making efforts for something that actually isn't that important. You could even have invested the time you spent making efforts for that, which anyhow probably you couldn't solve because you had to wait for better circumstances. You could meditate for an hour and you would have conserved your energy, your powers much more, and invested much more in something that would actually make you happy, for instance. So first off, it is this process of self-awareness and the awareness of the efforts that we're making. That is the place to start. Because often our becoming aware of the negative efforts we're making will release a lot of energy to take care of the things that are important and beautiful in our life. Because if we don't approach it like this, very often we will say, okay, we'll have to cut out certain parts of life, not making efforts in those directions. Like for instance, people say, oh, I can't be bothered with a relationship, with love, because it's just too complicated and I'm just flat out with my job anyway. Maybe that's not the right priority if you want to be happy and healthy, because a human being does have a need for intimacy, for togetherness, for that part of life. Whereas if you would eliminate a lot of the negative efforts, we can say, that you're making, you could very well have the surplus to also sustain a beautiful relationship or other things that would add to your quality of life and happiness. I don't know if that was satisfactory or helpful.
I think partially. I think there is still like the one thing which I still probably didn't get the answer is like when actually stop doing things. If because you describe certain dilemma that here is work which needs some urgency, and here is a relationship as well needs some attention. And then we have limited amount of the energy, and then how to make the right choice in those situations. I would like to know more about that.
Again, I think we will actually rarely find ourselves. I think we will rarely find ourselves in a situation where those two things are actually really conflictual. Because it can also be about optimizing the quality that we are somehow offering in different directions. Because when we make efforts, it's not just about making any efforts. We're talking about, we can say, adequate, beneficial efforts. So making efforts for things that are good for us, but also making the right efforts somehow, the right proportions. Because, for instance, in the case of relationship, you can say you have a job, you have to spend a certain amount of hours on your job, there isn't much you can do about it. And then you can wonder, maybe there is, I mean, sometimes also people have flexible working hours. If they're more efficient, maybe they would have more time. But many times that's not the case. You will have a fixed amount of time you need to be at work, which will leave you a limited amount of time for other things. And then you might consider, okay, but then I don't have time for a relationship, or I don't have time for my yoga practice, or whatever it is. First of all, very often when we say that, if we really look at what we spend our time on, often we will spend time on things that isn't actually that important for us. So that's a method actually of also releasing, we can say, more energy and potential for yourself, would be to, even for a while, write down everything you do. And it's a very confronting exercise, by the way. I've done it a few times and it's quite shocking, but like, honestly, write down what you do, even when you just sit and stare into nothingness for 10 minutes, or you potter about without really doing anything for half an hour in the morning, which I have a tendency to do if I'm not attentive, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's good to be aware of how you spend your time. Or maybe you just check Facebook, but then you realize if you pay attention, actually you just spent 45 minutes on there without even realizing. Or maybe you watch TV for an hour, and you will often see that all of that time actually adds up to a lot of time you didn't even realize you had, just because you didn't notice that you were kind of throwing it around a little bit. And it's good to be aware of that, just because then you can make the choice, okay, do I want to spend my time like this? Or could I maybe spend that time for something that would actually make me more happy? So I can warmly recommend you to try that if you haven't, just to become aware of how you spend your time. But even beyond that, for instance, with regard to a relationship, it's not necessarily so that you need loads of time to make efforts in a relationship. Often small gestures or kind of initiatives would go a long way in terms of creating a beautiful relationship, for instance. So there are different ways of making efforts, and it's much more about the quality, the adequate quality of that. Because sometimes you can spend a long time on something and it wasn't really the right thing to do. It doesn't make anybody more happy. And sometimes you spend 15 minutes on something small and it brings a lot of happiness to your friend or to your lover or whoever you somehow made that little effort for. So it's also in this way about making the right efforts, not just making efforts. And then you will see, most often, miraculously actually, our life is designed in such a way there is space for everything that there should be space for. If we cut out somehow the things that don't really belong and doesn't really make us happy, we actually do have some time for all the things that are really important. But that's again an exercise of awareness. You could often actually begin to discover that by this writing down what you do. And in this way, just bringing attention to what you do. Because you can really, I mean, honestly, you can have surprises on what you spend your time doing. And you wouldn't, I mean, if I asked you now, you say, no, I don't really waste any time. Try, and you might be quite surprised, actually, how you lose 15 minutes here and there without noticing. And again, it's not as bad sitting and, I don't know, contemplating life half an hour over your tea in the morning or something. That might be something that's really important for you to feel happy. Then that's totally fine. But just be aware you do it. Don't just, like think that you're super efficient all day long, and you're actually not. Might also be that you realize, well, I don't really need that time. I would actually be much more happy if I spent that time meditating. Could also be. But at least you know, and you have a chance to find out. So that could also be a good place to start.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else at this stage? Good. Then I'll continue a little bit, because somehow what you can understand the gist of it, as I'm speaking about efforts now, is that, the saying that the quality of our life is decided by the quality of the questions we ask ourselves. I could add here somehow that the beauty and richness of our life is also somehow decided by the efforts we're willing to make, we can say, because when we're not willing to make efforts, we stay within a comfort zone. That's somehow in a way we can say, is the definition of the comfort zone, is not wanting to make these beneficial efforts to get out of that limited perspective. And within our comfort zone, life is how it is somehow. And usually it will be the version where we have glimpses of pleasure and happiness, and the rest of it is pretty dull, if not even painful. So life becomes quite small when we don't want to make efforts. Then we have decided the parameters of our life, and this is what we stay within. This is your life, so to speak. There isn't much you can do about it except trying to be happy with what is within that frame. We can even say somehow the grandeur of your life, the beauty, the fulfillment is very much connected to these beneficial efforts. If you think of fairy tales, for instance, we have this longing for fairy tale ending, happily ever after. They make a lot of effort before they get to happily ever after. If they would be just sitting in their comfort zone in the movie or in the fairy tale, you wouldn't even bother watching because it would be boring and not worth looking at somehow, that story, because it wouldn't really be a story. It wouldn't be a story of discovery and nuances and happiness and beauty and difficulties and all the rest of it that fascinates us and makes us feel alive. Those come because they make effort to achieve something, whatever that is, or set out on a quest, or whatever, however it is manifested. And that's somehow what we do with our life when we're making efforts. We make it bigger, and we make it more nuanced and more beautiful and more satisfying as a result, even if to begin with also apparently a lot more difficult. And I mean, there will always be this temptation, but you should be wary of it though. When somebody says, because I don't know if you noticed all the advertisements, and think of this often, you have all these ads now, they come up on Facebook, on Instagram, and everywhere, YouTube, wherever you go, of how easy it is to look young, to look fit, to be perfect, to have the perfect hair, to something, and you don't even have to do anything. Just like that, you will be young and hot forever. We know it's not true, even if we kind of would like to believe it. That's our hope that it might be so. We just need to put that cream or something and all our problems are solved. It's kind of what makes us buy into it. So we do have that temptation, but we also know it's not true. So when somebody comes and promises you, you don't have to do anything, just do this and all your problems will be solved. Even if it's tempting, it will never be the truth somehow. That we will need to make some sort of efforts somewhere there. Otherwise, it just won't happen, because we won't leave the comfort zone, and therefore nothing will really have changed profoundly somehow. And kind of walking the spiritual path, of course, this becomes much more obvious, because here we are setting out to make our life bigger, to discover something more than we're used to in this moment. So we're aiming to go outside of our comfort zone. It is where we want to go. Believing that can happen without making efforts is a bit naive. I know that somehow it is a wish, especially those who are attracted to tantric practices, this idea that you don't have to make any efforts, it's just all pleasant and wonderful, and suddenly you're outside your comfort zone and life is a magical fairy tale. It does sound very appealing. And in a way you can say letting go and relaxation for sure is part of a tantric practice. Which is also why when we're talking about making efforts, it's not that our life becomes a kind of a miserable and difficult experience, in the sense that we have to live in a cell and only eat dry bread and, I don't know, have no central heating or something, but live under very difficult circumstances. Of course, it doesn't have to be like that. And that is exactly what the tantric practice offers us in reality. The realization that making efforts doesn't have to be being hard on yourself in that sense. But nevertheless, if we want to transform, it will always imply efforts or making efforts for something. We even speak about in Tantra this fundamental attitude. We can even somehow say it's kind of the premises of a tantric practice, the idea of making efforts and being relaxed, or what we also call awareness and relaxation. Now, if you noticed, when I speak about making efforts, we come back to consciousness, being aware, becoming aware of things a lot, because those two things are actually connected profoundly. Now, when we make an effort, beneficial, positive, we can say adequate effort, it does imply we're making conscious effort. Or in other words, we are aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Now, that in itself sometimes is something we consider sounds a bit difficult or complicated or uncomfortable, maybe, having to be attentive to everything. Because we somehow connect the whole idea of paying attention or focusing as something that takes efforts and that's really hard and that's a little bit uncomfortable and maybe even contracted somehow. And then Tantra comes with this idea that you can be very aware and make efforts, actually, combined with an attitude of relaxation. It's a very, very new concept. We can say it's one of the core concepts, actually, and the basis of any tantric practice, which is something that is very unique because it is challenging the way that we look on both of those concepts. Usually relaxation for us means really doing nothing, also hardly even thinking or paying attention to anything, but just vegging out, completely not noticing anything, kind of zoning off maybe on the sofa in front of a nice movie or something. But that's often what we think of when we think of relaxation. So to put awareness together with relaxation or effort together with relaxation seems like they're kind of antagonizing or opposites. Then the tantric practice comes and says the fundamental attitude is awareness and relaxation, or effort and relaxation. And that takes a little training somehow to get your head around and to have a proper experience of what it means. Because Tantra also comes and promises us, for instance, an effortless somehow life experience. Now I have a whole lecture here speaking about effort, so that can seem odd in the context of how we understand the tantric practice. Reality is that effortlessness is on the other side of effort. So first we have to make efforts to have the right attitude, and then it becomes an effortless experience of making efforts, so to speak. So until we have established ourselves in this tantric attitude of awareness and relaxation, we will have to make efforts to get there. And then afterwards, life will be experienced as quite effortless, in connection actually with this idea of happiness and the intuition we have that happiness means not making efforts. It's not so that we're never going to make efforts for anything anymore once we pass to the effortlessness, just that the experience of making efforts is very different. And there's a whole training in the beginning. For instance, you can do such a thing as a yogic relaxation, where you are relaxing the body without falling asleep. At least that's the aim. I know very often we tend to fall asleep exactly when attempting that, because we're so programmed that when we relax, it also means lights out. So it's a very powerful practice, actually, a yogic relaxation. Often we would not consider it like that. It seems more like a power nap at the end of a yoga class or something. It is actually a very good way of training this attitude of awareness and relaxation, or effort and relaxation, because you're making effort in that moment to stay present and conscious, relaxing your entire body part by part, for instance, and gradually relaxing deeper and deeper. But that relaxation, if you noticed, has a completely different quality than the relaxation of falling asleep in front of the telly or something like that. It comes with a quality, by the way, actually, of happiness or ecstasy that kind of bubbles up. I don't know if you ever did a yogic relaxation and afterwards you just felt really happy, but like kind of for no reason at all in particular, just you feel really happy. The secret actually to the happiness, the lasting happiness we're searching for, is exactly in that dynamics of effort and relaxation, or awareness and relaxation, which we're training in that technique, which is why we get a taste of it when we are relaxing profoundly in such a way. If you fall asleep, it doesn't have the same effect. You might still feel nice when you wake up because you had a nice power nap, and that always feels good, but it's not the same quality of the experience as when we manage to stay conscious and profoundly relax. It's even as if that relaxation takes on a completely different quality and gives us a completely different experience of who we are. Now, meeting life kind of from this point of view is what we're training gradually, because any training we would do in yoga or tantra would not be meant to only make you feel good in those 10, 15, 20 minutes you're doing such a relaxation or immediately afterwards. It would be aiming to create, we can say, lasting effects or lasting results for you, therefore letting you experience that state more and more. So what we're training when we do such a relaxation is actually a particular inner attitude of being able to relax and surrender, but staying very conscious, very present, which is sort of an effort that we're making in that moment. And then we will see that this attitude could help us also to make effort in our life differently. Now, it's not that the yogic relaxation is the only way that we can train this attitude. It's just a very simple and obvious place to start training it and have a clear feel and sensation of what that means. But we will start to act from that place. So when we are engaged in life, I don't know if you notice, very often when you make efforts, whether it's intellectual efforts to comprehend something or to listen or to produce something, or whether it's physical efforts or whatever it is, we tend to get a bit tense, like not just physically, but also emotionally and mentally. It's like we kind of clench up in order to achieve what we're aiming to achieve in that moment. In those moments, try to relax. Not stop doing what you're doing, but aim to relax while you're doing it. It's much easier if you have practiced yogic relaxation a lot, for instance, or done a lot of yoga and meditation. You'll have much better chances of being able to do that. But it can be an interesting experiment as you are finding yourself tensing up to make efforts intellectually or emotionally, physically, however, deep breath and just relax and continue doing what you were doing, but making the efforts while you are relaxed, so to speak. It can be quite a revelation, because you will see not only is your perspective completely different, but even your experience of those efforts will be very, very different, and it won't make you as tired, not nearly as tired as the very same efforts would have done in that very tense and pushing kind of attitude. So of course, it's not only about the, we can say, physical tension, it's also this kind of pushy attitude we sometimes have when we make efforts. So that attitude we have of surrender as well, when we are in the relaxation, to bring that in to those efforts. You're completely surrendered and you're doing your best, so to speak, would be a way of putting it. And you aim to stay really present in that, doing your best, completely relaxed and surrendered. And a very, very special experience and inner state actually can emerge on that background, which will start to make you understand different things about what it means to be happy, and tasting what we can say a more lasting happiness. Not to mention that will also transform the way that you are interacting with life and the way that you are making efforts, and potentially even the type of efforts that you choose to make in different directions. It becomes very obvious in other contexts too. Now, I mentioned, for instance, the efforts we make in terms of experiencing more profound intimacy and lovemaking, for instance. Now, often people, when they engage in erotic intimacy, it's actually a little bit stressful, because you know you want to achieve something in particular. Maybe you want to impress, maybe you want to do it right, maybe you don't want to do it well, maybe you want to make sure you get your orgasm, maybe something, but we tend to actually be a bit tense and rushed about it, somehow making efforts in that direction. But it becomes a very tense experience. That's not the correct way, for instance, of making efforts if we want to go deeper in intimacy. First, we have to surrender, relax, and then the real effort starts of continuing to do that and continuing to go deeper into that experience until that new world opens up. But if we approach that with very tense efforts, so to speak, you will never succeed, because you will not be able to break through that limit when you make efforts in such a way. And you would be surprised how many different areas of life that would be true for, because somehow intuitively you can see the point when we speak about intimacy and opening up to each other and experiencing more pleasure. Pleasure and intimacy doesn't appear if we're pushing and hurrying or something. That's kind of intuitively obvious. But it is like that also for many other areas of our life and many other types of efforts that we could engage in. So somehow these, we can say, beneficial, adequate efforts is what is allowing wonderful experiences, wonderful fruits, rich things to happen in our life. Making efforts, yes, but also making efforts in a new way. Making efforts from this tantric point of view, with the awareness and relaxation, or the effort and relaxation coexisting simultaneously. Any questions on this attitude of effort and relaxation, or awareness and relaxation?
Maria, I have a question regarding stress when it's about love making, and then would you recommend that a relaxation meditation before the act of love making would be good if there is this stress and tension?
For sure. I mean, if you find yourself stressed, meditating before or doing relaxation or maybe a little bit of massage that just makes you relax and so on would be a wonderful place to start. Because if you start from tension and stress, it'll be very hard to make efforts in the right way, so to speak. You will just get caught into more stress and tension the more you're making efforts to get out of it. So that would definitely be a moment to find a way to let go and relax, which could also be done, like, as I said, through some massage or caresses, or maybe talking a little bit, or however you feel that it's possible for you to just relax and surrender a bit.
And would you recommend as a couple to do this and do some consecration and maybe the transfiguration and eyes gazing before the lovemaking?
For sure. I mean, all these stages would stay recommended to have the correct setup. But since I'm not sure everyone here knows about, and it's also not about tantric lovemaking specifically today, but yes, I mean, would be very nice to start with these stages. And in a sense, you can say that a foreplay, or the beginning of intimacy, in a way has as a role always to induce this state of awareness and relaxation, like to be extremely present and attentive, but also to relax and surrender and open up to the experience. That could be prolonged in different ways, with massage, with other ways of playing with each other and so on. But that background of relaxation is really important in that phase.
Thank you so much.
So some of the ways that we are making efforts on a spiritual path, I mentioned a lot of them already. We make efforts, of course, to do yoga practice, to meditate. All of those are efforts, especially if we do it with the aim to improve the quality of and depth both of our yoga practice. Because here we also need to consider the effort is not just doing it. So getting yourself on your yoga mat and putting your body in some positions, for instance, would also be the efforts we make to increase the quality of that, the quality of your presence in that experience, maybe your flexibility, other ways in which you are increasing the kind of depth of that experience and the quality of that experience. Same with meditation. It's not just the effort of sitting still for half an hour, however long you choose daily. It's also the actual increase in concentration, really making efforts to improve the depth of focus and entering in a meditative state continuously. These are actually much harder parts of the effort somehow. Maintaining the quality, and I think that's also what Igor was mentioning a little bit earlier, when he said somehow even if you're enthusiastic about something, it can be hard even to maintain the quality of the effort you put in that direction, because we have a tendency to go a little bit on autopilot. Okay, I'm going to make this effort, and then we do it, but in a very kind of on a practical level. Let's say I said I was going to do yoga for an hour every day as my New Year resolution, and I do it, but I'm thinking of something else meanwhile. For instance, after a while, when the initial enthusiasm wears off. So maybe the much harder part of making efforts is this effort to stay with the quality of that effort and even deepening the quality of that effort in your practice. So that would be a way of making efforts, apart from just being on your yoga mat and for however long you decided, or in your meditation posture, deepening also the quality of that practice constantly and consciously. You could make efforts, for instance, in terms of fasting, as I said, that's another very common effort made in a spiritual practice for a lot of the benefits, both physical benefits in terms of awakening the inner fire, its purifying effects, and so on, not to mention the effects it has on your willpower and a lot of other aspects surrounding that. Now, initially, the effort that you make is to not eat for a day. Then you could say you could also make the effort of drinking enough water, aiming to stay in a good state somehow more and more as you are having that experience, not just sitting there waiting for it to finish and think about food or something, but even to deepen the quality of your fasting, for instance. And in this way, there will always be layers of the efforts that you're making, which are very important to take into consideration as well. Because otherwise we easily get a little bit of a formal sort of practice and effort, and then we're wondering why we don't have the results. Because the effort also implies that aspect of deepening the quality of the efforts that we're making. So that's efforts we're making very practically on that level. Other types of spiritual efforts could be anything you do in the name somehow in that direction of increasing self-awareness, of growth, of also the efforts, as I mentioned, to dare to look at the difficulties that come up. Because sometimes I even heard this from people, oh, but you practice yoga or tantra, so you should just be happy all the time. And then they don't know about this saying that in tantra, when is good is really good, when is bad is really bad. Because what happens when you start a process of deep practice and transformation of yourself is, of course, that it's not just now you're happy ever after and nothing is ever going to bother you anymore. Yes, you're aiming to get towards such a state, but it also implies looking at all the uncomfortable things that come up. Things which often we just choose not to face, or we choose not to put ourselves in situations that will somehow aggravate those tendencies inside us. Being willing to make efforts on a spiritual path of transformation means that we are also willing to look at the difficult things, to take the difficult feedback, to face the difficult emotions, or to see what is there inside and to dare to look into it and aim to transform it and make the necessary steps to do so. So sometimes it almost feels that life becomes more complicated when we start to look deeper inside. And that's where the efforts also become important, that we continue still our efforts in an appropriate way, of course, and in an adequate measure, but that we continue until we get to the other side of that experience. And then, yes, actually, we will see that our life quality and our state of happiness has increased from that. And gradually, the state of happiness becomes more and more predominant, but it's not necessarily so from the onset. And that we need to remember as well. Just because something suddenly gets a little bit harder doesn't mean necessarily you're going in the wrong direction, because we do have to somehow experience also the difficult things inside if we want to heal from them. I had, for instance, a student once. I was very impressed with her because she told me only afterwards that when she practiced a particular position, maybe you know it, the cobra pose or Bhujangasana, which works on your heart chakra, she would start crying and feeling so sad, but like every time she did it. And that lasted every single day for, I think, like 2 months she did it. Now, I was so impressed because she actually persevered for 2 months, having such an experience every time. And then she said, then it went away and she felt so relieved and happier than she ever was in her life before. It's a beautiful example, actually, of making efforts, we can say, to open up and to feel what is there, stuck there, that she hasn't related to, and that actually has blocked her heart a little bit, preventing her from interacting in a more profound way with the environment. And when going through that somehow perseveringly and with efforts, suddenly that released, and her experience of life from that level was completely different. And that is somehow what we have to expect can manifest one way or another when we wish to know ourselves more deeply. And we shouldn't shy away from that. We shouldn't fall for the temptation that someone will promise us, you never have to do anything or feel anything bad. Let me just take it all away and you will be happy forever. Because it doesn't work like that simply, and cannot work like that in a genuine process of transformation and growth. There will always be such a thing as, we can say, growing pains in order to get somewhere with yourself and in order to discover new things about yourself and become bigger, we can say, than you were before. It's not even an idea, this of making efforts, that is, we can say, particular for one spiritual tradition. You will have it in pretty much every religion, every spiritual practice. The Buddhists, for instance, are very big on it and even speak about 4 main different ways you can make efforts, which is about getting rid of negative tendencies inside and purifying yourself from that, cultivating the efforts you make also to cultivate positive inner states and so on. So there is a big emphasis put in many different practices, and sometimes even in a very schematic way, we can say, of how we should make efforts and in what direction in order to be happy, to be free, to be successful in our spiritual practice, to achieve enlightenment and so on. But always, it does imply these very, we can say, almost systematic, but for sure adequate and beneficial efforts that we make in different directions. And we should not, even if it is tempting, believe that it will be possible for us to have profound transformations in the absence of the necessary efforts made, which could be on all levels, and most often in our spiritual practice will be having to be made on all levels of our being, because we will be faced with obstacles in life until somehow we can say we have created a state of harmony that is not dependent so much to the same extent on outer circumstances, which is from where this real happiness, this profound happiness will emerge, which is in very deep connection to this tantric attitude of effort and relaxation, or awareness and relaxation, that we are able to be relaxed into life, making exactly the adequate efforts. When our efforts are very aligned, we can say, and are exactly right for what we're aiming to achieve, they will seem much more effortless. But in the process of learning that, we have to also sometimes make very difficult, we can say, efforts, or the experience of making efforts can be felt as very difficult and confronting at times, which is part of growing up, we can say, spiritually, or growing outside of our limited sense of self, or outside of our comfort zone. So these were the main things I had to say today. I was hoping also you have some experiences, questions, things to share. Maybe if you feel more courageous now, could also talk a little bit about what you consider efforts, what you would like to make efforts for, and anything else you would like to discuss, really. Questions, please feel free.
Can I ask one more question? You said about importance of the state of relaxation when we are taking an effort, and I was just wondering, what if there is a situation when we on regular basis experience like failure, like, I don't know, let's say I would say I want to open the company. I never like run the company before, so on each stage I'm experienced like I don't know, failure, mistakes and stuff like that. Or I don't know, like with sexual continence, when there are like stages when you feel like maybe blocked, and then you don't necessarily have this clarity what else to do next to actually overcome the obstacle. And then I'm just wondering if there is some type of practice which in those moments when we have already certain experience of experiencing that the same state of like I don't know, not achieving success is repeating all the time, if we can practice certain things, certain maybe, I don't know, spiritual practice to actually get ourselves into the state of relaxation, and before taking the action then actually put ourselves in the right place. Yeah, so that's my question.
I mean, generally speaking, to achieve a state of relaxation, to have a regular yoga practice, to meditate in this yogic relaxation, are actually kind of the basic practice that will allow that to emerge more and more. Then emphasizing it as an attitude, because it's also a bad habit we have to get stressed or to get tense about things. It's a bad habit, and you need to start catching yourself in it and consciously relax. Could even to take little breaks of conscious breathing or something throughout your day, just to put yourself back in that state of relaxation. If you find yourself back in the habit of being a bit stressed or tense or pushing or something like this. And also what you say about this somehow feeling exposed to continuous failure, it's true that it can feel a bit discouraging when we don't manage. But for instance, I mean, in the case of starting a company, if you don't know how to do it, you make mistakes. It's normal to make mistakes. If we do something we don't really know how to do, or we do something for the first time, we have a little bit of a phobia in modern times to make mistakes. Like, we're usually very afraid of it because we feel if we make a mistake, it means that we're a mistake or something is wrong with us, which it doesn't. It just means we tried something and we didn't figure it out. But if you learn from that, the mistake is not a problem. On the contrary, I mean, we learn from mistakes. It's actually how we get wiser most of the time. The people who are courageous enough to make a mistake are also the ones who learn the most times. Now, of course, if you keep repeating the same mistake endlessly, you're either very stubborn or not very attentive. So then it's not a positive thing anymore. But as long as they're not the same mistakes, we can say, mistakes are not necessarily a bad thing. It helps you learn. And then after you made some mistakes, you learn how to correct them. At some point, you will know how to run a company. You might even be able to teach other people how to do it. Same with continence, like neurotic amorous continence, to learn, for instance, in the case of you as a man, to have multiple orgasms without losing your energy. You can't expect to be perfect from the beginning. Yeah, sometimes you won't manage, but then you learn from that and then you try again somehow. In a way, you can say inherent in this state of making efforts is also certain optimism that you keep going, making those efforts wholeheartedly, learning from your mistakes because you're making conscious efforts, and not falling for this temptation, because that's often what makes the mistake or the perceived failure in that moment very difficult, is that we start to judge ourselves. Oh, but I'm always like this. I'm a total failure. I am wrong. I am a mistake. It's not what it means. Just because you made a mistake doesn't mean you are a mistake somehow. And that's an important habit to get rid of, because it does paralyze us a lot in actually making efforts when we're really afraid to make mistakes. We just need to also have the honesty, if we made the same mistake 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times, it's time to make efforts to be more attentive, not to make that mistake again, so to speak, because of course that's not healthy. But not to also be too discouraged when sometimes we don't manage, because that can be a valuable experience as well in our process of growth and learning, if we approach it correctly.
Thank you.
Hi, Maria. This is Walter. I have a question. When you're making an effort, of course, you need to leave your comfort zone, as you mentioned. Yeah. But how do you know that you making the right effort in terms of, okay, this will result in you or me being happier, or it can cross the line and then I'll get to a situation where I may feel that this resulted in me learning a bit more of something, but is really not me anymore. It just got me to a place where I don't feel as comfortable. So how do you know that, okay, this is something that is worth pursuing and this is something that doesn't worth pursuing in a way? Do you get some sort of indication of that?
I think first of all, it's important to be clear for yourself what it actually is that you want, like what it is you're aiming to achieve. Now, of course, sometimes we can have a little bit some misunderstandings around that as well. Say, for instance, with the relationship example again, obviously with being in a relationship, what you're wishing to achieve is to have a nice, happy relationship and to be happy because of that. Hopefully both of you in that experience, and that will be the aim. And then, of course, you can say you can make some efforts in that direction, like out of attachment, even hanging on maybe to a relationship that, for instance, isn't working, or at least trying to make it work in a way that it just isn't, and maybe even is making things worse. But you do believe you're doing it because you want it to be better. Somehow you have to, of course, stop in these moments and also sometimes have a bit of honesty with yourself, because I think most often when we are not making the right efforts is also because we don't want to be completely honest with ourselves for whatever reason somehow. So we need to be honest with ourselves, saying, okay, am I actually doing my best? Am I actually willing somehow to do the correct efforts in the name of love? And if it's an answer, yes to that, okay, is it giving more happiness? And really looking at what is the situation there with honesty, because somehow most often we know if it is the right effort to make or not. Or if you have an ambition in a certain project or something, you can make a lot of efforts in a certain direction, but then you find out in the end, oh, this didn't actually make me happy. Okay, but that could also be, first of all, a very valuable realization that that wasn't actually what you were striving for. Then that's a good opportunity to have some introspection and say, okay, what is it actually I'm looking for? Really, like what is it that I want? And be very clear of that. And then it will be easier for you also to take the correct steps next time around, instead of just pursuing it in the same way and ending up disappointed every time. But it has a lot to do with this inner honesty, and also does imply, yes, sometimes we do realize only afterwards that we made efforts in the wrong way. But the important thing to understand is also here, it's still better to make efforts than not to make efforts, because when you make efforts, you will find out if it was the right efforts or not. Like, you will have a mirror, but if you don't do anything, you won't find out, because you won't have any possibility for a feedback. You won't even know if it was a mistake or not somehow, because you never engaged that. You never engaged life, we can say, through this making efforts. If you want like a more specific answer, you need to also give me a more specific example.
No, that was great. That was great. Thank you very much.
I would invite all of you to contemplate these ideas a bit. And if you didn't make New Year resolutions, to try to make one. But in the light of this idea of making efforts in the right way, and also trying to implement some of these ideas, this with bringing the awareness, even to try to make this list of how you spend your time and how you're making efforts, to just become aware of it. When you find yourself making efforts, asking yourself, what are you making them for? Like, what is actually, is this something that is going to make you happier? Is this taking you in the direction that you are longing for or not? And also training this attitude of relaxation. So to aim to try this way, or more and more perceive this way of making efforts without tensing, without pushing. It could be a very, very important revelation to have this one of learning to be relaxed. And there, the yogic relaxation, as I said, although simple, is a very good place to start. Of course, along with other practices of yoga, which have similar effects, but that one is very obvious in that particular attitude, we can say, or that particular effect. And to spend some time contemplating as well, because often as well, sometimes as we can also kind of make our New Year's resolutions a bit just in the spur of a moment. Give it some thought, not because it has to be necessarily a New Year resolution, but just this this idea of taking the opportunity that somehow we have the feeling we start fresh when we start a new year. And take that energy of enthusiasm that is right now to choose an area in which you want to make these beneficial efforts. And then really to make a bit of a project of that for yourself. Because if you have the, we can say, perseverance with it, you can experience a shift. And once you have one, and that's the secret, once you have made the adequate efforts enough, you have the results, you will be encouraged to do it much more in the future. So every success will encourage you to continue with your beneficial efforts. And that is often kind of a bit of a trap in this direction, we give up too soon, just before even often we're successful. And then if we fail, it's a little harder next time, a little harder next time, a little harder next time. So it's very important also when we start making adequate efforts, don't again overload yourself completely in the beginning and promise yourself something that for sure you cannot in this moment somehow manage at all. Start with things that are achievable, and in this way you also gain much more confidence in continuing further. It's very, very valid when we're speaking about spiritual practice to manage somehow not to become like out of enthusiasm, to overreach or make a too big goal for ourselves to begin with. Start with something smaller, something that you know you can manage, like doing, I don't know, half an hour yoga every day for the next week or something. It again depends. If you are used to doing a lot of yoga, maybe you can say 1.5 hours for the next month or something, and that would be fine for you. But you have to start somehow with efforts in accordance to what you are able to do in this moment. And then I would suggest that you rather also spend some time exactly on noticing if you are wasting a lot of energy on things that aren't actually important for you, so you can harness that and use it to make the right efforts as you're going further. So if you have any more questions or comments, I am available.
Maria, I would like to ask one.
Yes.
Hi. It has to do with consecration, and I know maybe some people might not know it, but I'll just take a chance to ask. Kind of lately, I'm experiencing a little bit more difficulty receiving clear answers. And so I was interested in kind of understanding how can I place my efforts in a good direction to improve this. I don't know if it has to do with the fact that I also have quite a bit of back pain in the late kind of couple of month and a half. So yeah, thank you.
But when you say you have a trouble getting an answer, is it that do you ever get an answer? Do you know what it feels like when you get one, when you don't get one, or how's the situation?
So so when I started doing consecration, I usually had very clear answers. So I could feel the warmth in my back, that sensation kind of flowing down the spine. And I still do sometimes, but a bit less than before. The times where I don't feel anything at all are extremely rare. So I do maybe feel something up above the head or just around the head, but not necessarily that flush of energy as I have experienced other times.
Yeah. So just for the context of others, if you don't know what it is, because otherwise it gets a bit maybe unrelatable to listen to, a consecration is a way of aiming to align yourself with a bigger picture. And we can say somehow align yourself with the cosmic flow of things, which is a technique of actually surrendering. In a way, it's a good thing to bring up. It's something we teach in our courses as well. It is actually a way of helping very much to make efforts in the right way, because you kind of detach from the effort you're about to make in the moment that you're consecrating. And in this technique, you will perceive what we can call an answer, or a feeling of aligning yourself with the bigger picture. And that is what Francesca is speaking about. Now, I think the kind of one of the common obstacles with the effort of making the consecration, apart from taking the time to do it before you do something, so that in itself you could say is an effort, there's also the effort of deepening the quality of that, which somehow is a bigger effort. And anyone who's been doing consecration, especially if they've been doing it for years, it easily becomes a bit of a formality, or something where you don't make the effort to actually be fully present and make yourself available, because that is an effort. Like, it's an effort in that moment to let go of everything else, to be fully present and to make yourself available for that, which is a much bigger effort than just closing your eyes and staying for some moments. So I think that's probably the place to kind of look in terms of making efforts in that direction. Of course, if you have pains in your body that's distracting you a lot, that's an obvious answer, maybe why you wouldn't feel so strongly the answers, because you are distracted by a discomfort, and physical discomfort can be a very big obstacle in meditation and also therefore in consecration. But look into that if you are somehow making the same efforts to take it as seriously, we can say, and make yourself as present and as available as you do in moments where you have a very strong answer. Because I would suspect, unless it is the pain that makes the difference, that is where the difference would be in reality.
Thank you. Okay. And yeah, I can share a little story if you want as well. It actually is related to consecration as well and Angels Week. They were teaching a protection technique, and I was yeah, I really wanted to do it, so I consecrated it, and I felt I didn't get an answer, and so I had to wait until the next day, and again I consecrated it. I didn't get an answer, so this went on for like 3 days, and on the 4th day I got a big yes. So it was like a definite yes, and then I did it, and it was amazing, and it was such a much more enriching experience than just like listening to it without doing it.
Yes, but that also is an effort to actually make the effort of also respecting what you feel in the consecration from a certain point of view, because there could also be a temptation to just ignore that and do as you want instead. Last chance. If not, then I thank you all very much for coming. It was a pleasure, a pleasurable effort. And I hope to see you soon again in other contexts. And I wish you good luck with your beneficial efforts this year. The one with fear was actually a very good one, by the way. The only sharing that was in the beginning, the efforts that we could make to not be gripped by fear, because that's probably one of the biggest obstacles that most of us are facing right now, to not be brought out of a state of harmony by fears in different ways about what is going on. So to make the efforts to stay somehow centered and good and harmonious, and not to be caught up in fears, would be a wonderful idea actually to consider. Good, but thank you very much, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Maria, so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Maria. Thank you.